for securing this debate. I think it's a very important one, and of course it has particular significance around this time. For years here in the House of Commons, I have chaired meetings in the Grand Committee room where we've commemorated Halabja year after year after year. And indeed, in 1988, along with some other members, cross-party, I took a group of women to a hospital in London where some of the survivors of the Halabja incident were actually recovering. They were women who had been badly burned from the use of the chemicals, and some of them could not speak because the effect of the chemical weapons had actually harmed their windpipes. I hope those people survived, and I was glad that at least some of them had the opportunity to be brought to London for that treatment. And in 1988-89, my honourable friend for Islington, who was here earlier, attempted to protest at the Iraqi embassy about the use of chemical weapons against the Kurds. And, of course, the ambassador at that time told us he knew nothing about it. It was all a mystery to him. And he said, "Would you like to come and visit Baghdad?" And we said, "No, we'd actually like to go and visit Kurdistan, where the chemical weapons attack has taken place." And he continued to say, "I don't know anything about it, but I will get in touch with Baghdad and see what we can do." Well, he played a cat and mouse game with us for several months, a period of 6 months. At the end of it, I sent a letter to the Financial Times saying this was obviously just a game. It wasn't a game for us as politicians who had followed the Kurds for many years. We actually protested here in this House in 1988, 89 and throughout. And I first became involved with the Kurds as early as 1977, before I was a politician, when many of them were in Cardiff at the university as students. One of them, of course, but later, was Bahram Salih. And many prominent Kurds were present at the university. And there were also Iraqi students, and they all told us about what was actually happening in Iraq. It was very difficult to get an accurate picture at that time. And it wasn't until the chemical weapons attack, really, that the West, public in the West, were made very aware of the kind of weapons Saddam Hussein was prepared to use against his own people. Of course, the charge of genocide was proved in the tribunal in Iraq, where many prominent Iraqis, and Iraqis mainly, were tried. And Ali Hassan al-Majid, of course, who subsequently was sentenced to death and was known as Chemical Ali, and the charge of genocide was made against him, and the charge of genocide was proved against Ali Hassan al-Majid. Now, those of us who campaigned over a long period of time, I chaired the campaign against repression for democratic rights in Iraq, Qadri, which many people, Kurds and Iraqis living in London, were actually members of at the time. And one of the things that we did constantly was publish the records of what was happening to the Kurds, to the Iraqis, what was going on in the prisons. We had actually very good accounts, they were horrific accounts, of the kind of torture that was being used against the people of Kurdistan and the people of Iraq. And some of the tortures, of course, were horrific. And later, when I actually opened the Genocide Museum in Kurdistan, when it was first opened, and I remember relatives of those who had been killed during the Anfal campaign coming to me. It was a very memorable day. It was snowing, it was grey, and to go into that museum of torture, to see where so many Kurds had perished at the time, left a lasting impression on all of us. And women were coming towards me with photographs of their relatives who had died, wrapped in cling film, and they were elderly women, and they were pushing these photographs and showing me which of their relatives had died in that torture centre in Sulaymaniyah. Of course, Cardri collected a lot of evidence. We had photographs, we had witness statements, and when Indite was set up a few years later, Indite also for 7 years collected evidence of Iraqi war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And that, of course, that evidence was used, I'm glad to say, in the trials which subsequently took place in Baghdad. Now, many of us knew or thought we knew what was going on in Iraq. Of course, wasn't fully explained until really after 2003. But I first went to Kurdistan in 1991, and I went back there, I suppose, every 2 or 3 years after that. And, you know, there were constant stories of disappearances, of sightings of people in prisons, and nobody quite knew where many of their loved ones had gone. But we know that the Anfal campaign was horrific. Now, I look back at a Human Rights Watch report, which was published in July 1993, and it's headed Genocide in Iraq, the Anfal campaign against the Kurds. And it says that allegations about enormous abuses against the Kurds by government security forces had been circulating in the West for years before the events of 1991. Kurdish rebels had spoken of 4,000 destroyed villages and an estimated 182,000 disappeared persons during 1988 alone. The Anfal, the official military code name used by the government in its public pronouncements and internal memoranda, was well known inside Iraq, especially in the Kurdish region. As all the horrific details have emerged, remember this was written in 1993, this name has seared itself into popular consciousness, much as the Nazi German Holocaust did with its survivors. The parallels are apt and often chillingly close. In February 1990, Human Rights in Iraq, Middle East Watch, reconstructed what took place from exiled sources, with what in retrospect turned out to be a high degree of accuracy. Even so, some of the larger claims made by the Kurds seem too fantastic to credit. As it transpires, this has been a humbling learning process for all those foreigners who followed Kurdish affairs from abroad. Western reporters, relief workers, human rights organisations and other visitors to Iraqi Kurdistan have come to realise that the overall scale of the suffering inflicted on the Kurds by their own government was by no means exaggerated. And now, Middle East Watch went on to say that it can now demonstrate convincingly a deliberate intent on the part of the government of Saddam Hussein to destroy, through mass murder, part of Iraq's Kurdish minority. 2 government instruments, the government's 1987 national census and the declaration of prohibited areas, were institutional foundations of this policy. These instruments were implemented against the background of nearly 2 decades of government-directed Arabization, in which mixed-race districts, or else lands that Baghdad described as desirable or strategically important, saw the Kurdish population diluted by Arab migrant farmers, provided with ample incentives to relocate and guarded by government troops. The logic of the Anfal, however, can't be divorced either from the Iran-Iraq War, because after 1986, both the PUK, Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, and the KDP, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, the two major parties, received support from the Iranian government and sometimes took part in joint military raids against Iraqi government positions. And it goes on to describe the link. Now, that, of course, doesn't make any difference to what Saddam Hussein did to his own people. While many will be familiar with the attacks on Halabja in March 1988, the incident caused a brief international ripple. They may be surprised to learn that the first use of poison gas against the Kurds by central government occurred 11 months earlier. All told, Middle East Watch recorded 40 separate attacks on Kurdish targets, some of them involving multiple sorties over several days between 1987 and August 1988. Each of these attacks were war crimes, involving the use of a banned weapon. The fact that non-combatants were often the victims added to the offence. In Anfal, at least 50,000 and possibly 100,000 people, many of them women and children, were killed out of hand between February and September 1988. And their deaths didn't come in the heat of battle. These Kurds were systematically put to death in large numbers on the orders of the central government in Baghdad. Days, sometimes weeks, after being rounded up in villages marked for destruction, or else while fleeing from army assaults in prohibited areas. Two experienced researchers from Human Rights Watch spent 6 months in northern Iraq between April and September 1992, gathering testaments about the Anfal. Previously, one 12-year-old boy had been the only known survivor on many accounts. The Kurds, men, women and children, had been trucked southward to the Arab heartland of Iraq in large numbers and then disappeared. It was assumed they'd all been summarily executed, but there was no proof at that time. But anybody who subsequently has stood, as one of the honourable gentlemen opposite mentioned, by the side of a mass grave, and I've had to stand at the side of many mass graves in Iraq, seeing the bodies being excavated. And I remember one particular occasion when I was in Kurdistan, when what was assumed to be the mass grave of Peshmergas was being excavated. And around stood relatives of the Peshmerga who they thought had been placed in that grave. And slowly the skeletons were brought out. And there was one old man standing by me, and he recognised his son, who was one of the Peshmerga, and he recognised him only from the wedding ring on his hand, because he had got married a couple of weeks before. And that's how his father recognised the body of his son. And many of us who've seen mass graves elsewhere in Iraq and Kurdistan will know what a terrible occasion it is when family are standing around waiting to identify a piece of cloth, a ring, a piece of jewellery, a piece of clothing, and those who they couldn't identify, they were put back. I was in Al-Hilla seeing the excavation there, because a team of British forensic scientists was helping on that occasion, and they found babies still held in the arms of their mothers or their fathers. But when they couldn't identify the body, they would put the remains back in a plastic bag and tie it up and put it on the top of a grave. And then people would walk around the graves, looking inside the bags, looking to see if they recognised anybody. And that, I think, is an appalling way to have to identify the body of a